is the Trump impact, especially on India. Donald Trump is all set to return to the White House and become the 47th president of the United States. Today, 10:30 p.m. is when he'll be taking part in his official ceremony. And the new U.S. presidency can impact India. I'm going to talk about a little more sector specifically. First, I want to talk about the policy proposals that have been highlighted by Donald Trump during his election period. First of all, policies are relatively expansionary in nature. Something like lowering tax rates for corporates is also on the cards. Something that stands out is the tariff hike. He's proposed 60% or higher tariffs on China imports and maybe 10 to 20% tariffs on the rest of the world. Mass deportation of illegal immigrants as well as increased influence over the feds is what we've picked up from commentary. Now, in terms of the impact on Indian economy, well, as per Nomura, the economic impact on India could be limited. The GDP growth may be only impacted by 0.1 percentage points from a lower perspective. We could gain from the ongoing supply chain shifts from China, and Nomura also states that India bonds may benefit from lower risk premium, and we are well prepared to handle the kind of volatility from the US policies. In terms from a sectoral impact, I just want to know there are a lot of moving parts in anything we're talking about. The official moves have yet to be made, but for the IT sector, it could be limited. The IT service players are much more insulated from anti-immigration policies and have localized their workforce since the first term of Trump. But the key risk is the Fed rate cut pathway, which is what US discretionary spends are on. When you talk about IT stocks in focus, you have something like a TCS, Infosys, and HCL Tech, which have anywhere between 50 to 65% of their Q3 US revenues coming from the region. You have Wipro, 63% of their Q3 revenues were from the US. LTI Mindtree, high exposure with the US. If you could just get the stocks there, 74.7% of your US revenues, and a Tech Mahindra 23%. Next up, you have the pharmaceutical companies. Uncertain impact because there are two parts of the card. You have increased competition in the generic business, which could have a negative impact on companies, and expansion of the Medicare program beneficiaries could be a positive. So some of the pharma stocks in focus, you have a DRL, a Lupin, a Sun Pharma. All of these companies have over 30% exposure to US revenues as a total of their FY24 sales, as well as a Cipla and Torrent Pharma, which are notable mentions. In terms of oil and gas, there are certain Trump policies that are pro-oil and gas policies that could lead to bearish sentiment in global prices. Trump has promised to kind of put an end to the Russia-Ukraine war as well as the tensions in the Middle East, which could lower the geopolitical risk premium that crude prices are currently factoring in. In terms of beneficiaries, it's positive for your IOCL, BPCL and HPCL because it could increase their marketing margins. It's negative for, something like an ONGC and Oil India, which because it has lower crude oil prices, and it's also could be positive from your gas stocks like Indraprastha Gas or MGL because lower LNG prices will help margins. Up next, you have the auto ancillary companies, an uncertain impact because increased tariff on China could benefit the Indian players in terms of rising rising share in terms of US, but any stricter tariff restrictions for India could also have a negative implication. Companies can counter some of the risk by kind of localizing their assembly plants in the US, but any full-scale operations in the US could also have an impact on return ratios. Some of the auto anch stocks that have a significant exposure to the US, you have Sona BLW, 40% of their revenues in FY25 came from the North American region. Bharat Forge, 25% of their revenues came from the USA in FY24, as well as the Balkrishna Industries, where 18% of their revenues came from the United States, from the North America region. In FY24. Then lastly, you have the textile companies. Imposition of trade barriers to China could benefit Indian companies. Better economy in the US could help in terms of the retail sentiment for textile. India currently has an 8.3% market share. Stocks in focus, well, you have something like an Arvind, a Gokaldas, as well as a Welspun Corp that could see some kind of impact. And lastly, of the solar module makers, uncertain impact because higher tariffs on China will benefit Indian players. However, if there are any tariffs on India, that could have an impact on their profitability. You have something like Envori Energies, which is in focus. Over 50% of their FY24 revenues was from the US markets, and Premier Energies, large solar cell exporter to the US. But Gaurang, I'll come to you. If you had to pick a theme in terms of the Trump trade or some sector that you feel could, benefit or be negatively hit with the new US presidency, what would it be?
There are a lot of pieces of puzzle which are in the air, and they need to settle down at ground. And they will only settle down once we have clarity in terms of what Mr. Donald Trump does as and when he assumes the Oval Office, starting tomorrow onwards. So, yeah, there are concerns, but 2, 3 points that I would be very, very keenly watching out for. One is to put an end to the geopolitical situation, Ukraine, Russia, excuse me, and what kind of assistance or help or contribution does Mr. Trump provide to the situation in the Middle East? China-related policies and tariffs, if that has to be put at work, then I think it could turn out to be benefit India and rest of the APEC regions and countries. And of course, tax cuts that he's spoken about in US. I think if he does that and he puts the tariffs that he's spoken about, the election in US presidential election of tax cuts in US and tariff hike in certain percentage, then this equation will put Mr. Powell in a very difficult situation, because that will lead to inflationary pressure, and that will lead to the entire framework that Mr. Powell has decided in terms of rate cuts and the time frame. That'll go out of the window. So what I'm trying to say is, political leaders across the world say a lot of things before the election happens. Post-election, if they happen to win, I think they mellow down. So let us wait for him to, assume the Oval Office and see what kind of policies they make. I think then we'll take a call. But I will still, as a brokerage out, will still be positive on 2 themes that you mentioned, IT as well as pharma.
Okay, so IT and pharma to watch out for in terms of the Trump trade.